Penguin Random House Canada presents Peace and Good Order, The Case of Indigenous Justice in Canada by Harold R. Johnson, read for you by Craig Lauzon. To the next 7 generations. Opening argument. The case against Canadian justice. Late in the evening, on February 9, 2018, I heard the decision in the Gerald Stanley trial announced on the radio. An all-white jury had found Stanley not guilty of shooting and killing Colten Boushie, a 22-year-old Cree man from the Red Pheasant First Nation. On August 9, 2016, Boushie and 4 of his friends, Kiora Watney, Cassie Cross-Whitstone, Eric Meachance, and Belinda Jackson, had spent the day swimming. Cassidy Cross-Whitstone was driving their Ford Escape home when they hit a culvert and punctured a tire. They pulled into a farm belonging to Gerald Stanley, a 56-year-old white man, and Cross-Whitstone and Meachance got out of their vehicle. They were confronted by Stanley and his son Sheldon, who believed the men intended to steal an ATV. Meachance and Cross-Whitstone jumped back into the Escape and tried to drive away, but veered into Gerald Stanley's car and crashed. While Sheldon Stanley ran toward the house, Gerald Stanley grabbed a semi-automatic handgun from his shed. When Stanley fired 2 warning shots, Cross-Whitstone and Meachance ran off, leaving Colten Boushie and the 2 women in the Escape. At trial, conflicting testimony was offered as to what happened next. Gerald Stanley testified that when he lunged into the Escape to take the keys from the ignition, the gun went off accidentally, hitting Colten in the head. Belinda Jackson testified that the gun was fired intentionally. 12 white jurors believed Mr. Stanley. After 20 years as a lawyer, having worked first as defense counsel and then as a prosecutor in the high-crime communities of northern Saskatchewan, I experienced some vicarious trauma in response to the verdict. I shut off the radio and ignored all social media. I didn't want to be part of it. I wanted to hide in my cabin on my trapline with my wife, my writing, and my dog team, and pretend that I was not part of that world. It wasn't my file. I hadn't been hired by the accused or the family of the victim. I had retired, thankfully, and so hadn't been involved in the case in any way. I could tell myself it was none of my business, and no one had asked me to make it so. The next morning, I awoke to find a text message on my phone from a dear friend, a retired provincial court judge. Harold, I hope that you are fast asleep and that this text doesn't wake you. It's 12:38 a.m. I'm sitting at my kitchen table and I'm crying. I'm ashamed. After hearing the verdict in the Stanley case in North Battleford, I'm ashamed. I'm ashamed of my Caucasian heritage, and I should have seen how stacked the system is against Indigenous Canadians. I feel so ashamed, and I must be sorry for myself too, because I want to cry. The forbearance of the families who suffered this is more than I can understand right now. I'm sorry to bother you with this, Harold. I just needed to tell somebody how sad I feel. Later that day, my wife and I left our home in the boreal forest. We were heading more than 400 kilometers south, down to Sweetgrass First Nation near Colten's home, to attend a ceremony. As I drove, I had lots of time to think about what my friend had said in our subsequent conversation. The thing that discourages me so much is that I believe that in rural farmland Saskatchewan, there are many that believe Stanley had the right to kill Colten Boushie. My friend would know. After a career as a lawyer and then a judge in northern Saskatchewan, he retired to a ranch in the south, happy to be back where he grew up, close to family and horses. He heard all the things his farmer neighbors were saying. Coming together in local restaurants and other meeting places, they reinforced each other's dislike of Indigenous peoples. When the majority of a community believes the stereotypes, and when the jury is selected from this pool, The acquittal of a white farmer in the shooting of an Indigenous man is all but guaranteed. While we were crossing that desolate land, far from the nearest gas station or other facility with a washroom, my wife asked me to pull over, and she stipulated, not in a farmyard. I realized that this tough woman, who lives with me on a trap line, who regularly walks trails alone in the dark, knowing there are wolves out there, whom I have never seen to be afraid of anything, was now afraid of farmers. And if we believe Gerald Stanley, the farmers were afraid of her. What do I know about fear? Not much. I know that if a dog is afraid, it is more likely to bite than a dog that is angry. I know that if a person is afraid for long enough, their fear turns into anger, and their anger becomes hate. And I know that hate leads to suffering. Shortly after the Stanley decision, the Indigenous street gangs in Saskatchewan informed First Nations leadership that they were armed and prepared to start shooting. All they needed was for someone to give them the okay. Our leadership told them to stand down. The Saskatchewan government, in an effort to garner votes, added fuel to the fire by issuing assault rifles to conservation officers and altering trespass laws to remove the assumption of free access to unoccupied lands. There is no reason to give conservation officers assault rifles other than to send a message that Saskatchewan is prepared to go to war with its Indigenous population. All that was needed in the province for a full-blown race war was one more incident, one more death, and for leadership on both sides to use the incident for their own political ends. Indigenous peoples across Canada were extremely upset by the Stanley decision. It seemed that Canadian justice cared more about the property rights of settlers than about the lives of Indigenous youth. Gerald Stanley had used deadly force to protect his property, and the law decided that was okay. Meanwhile, Indigenous peoples were serving prison time at an ever-increasing rate. The 2017-18 annual report of the Federal Office of the Correctional Investigator stated, in the 10-year period between March 2009 and March 2018, the Indigenous inmate population increased by 42.8%, compared with a less than 1% overall growth during the same period. As of March 31, 2018, Indigenous inmates represented 28% of the total federal in-custody population, while comprising just 4.3% of the Canadian population. The situation continues to worsen for Indigenous women. Over the last 10 years, the number of Indigenous federally sentenced women increased by 60%, growing from 168 in March 2009 to 270 in March 2018. At the end of the reporting period, 40% of incarcerated women in Canada were of Indigenous ancestry. These numbers are distressing. The over-incarceration of Indigenous peoples continues despite efforts to slow it down. In 1995, the Canadian government amended Section 718.2e of the Criminal Code to require judges, upon sentencing Indigenous offenders, to consider their unique circumstances. Despite the change to legislation, though, the incarceration rate has continued to climb. The Supreme Court of Canada, in the Gladue decision in 1999, told judges they had to obey the Criminal Code and specifically told them which circumstances to consider, including the effects of the residential school system, family breakdown, dislocation, dispossession, poverty, and poor living conditions. Yet still, the incarceration rate climbed. The Supreme Court, in the Ipili decision in 2012, again told judges they had to obey the Criminal Code, and again, nothing changed. In the 1940s and 50s, there were very few Indigenous people in prison. Disparities with regard to the incarceration of Indigenous men began only in the 1960s and have steadily widened since then. Incarceration rates of Indigenous women have begun to follow this same upward curve. The incarceration rates of children likewise continue to increase, with no end in sight. The incarceration rate of Indigenous peoples in Saskatchewan is among the highest in...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?